Greetings all, a very warm welcome to you on behalf of Sightsavers to this Disability Livelihoods webinar, Be Inclusive, Employment and Livelihoods. I will now hand over to Lisa Morris, who will officially start the webinar. Lisa, over to you. Thanks so much.
Hazel, thank you so much. Welcome everyone. My name is Lisa Morris. I'm the Learning Advisor in Inclusive Futures in the Disability Inclusive Development Programme, and I sit in Sightsavers, who manage the overall consortium fund. So welcome. We've had more than 120 people sign up for this webinar. I can also see some introductions happening in the chat. We're really keen to hear from you and bring in your experience as well. So please do introduce yourself in the chat as we go along. Next slide, please, Hazel. And we're really here today to explore what works and what doesn't when we're looking at the full participation of people with disabilities in livelihoods programs. And the excellent panel that we have today are bringing experience from across the Inclusive Futures Consortium. So they'll be sharing about what they've found in terms of what works and what doesn't. But first, please let me introduce the Inclusive Futures program. So Inclusive Futures is led by a consortium of organisations, and together we pilot and scale different approaches to disability inclusive development. So we're funded by UK Aid, and we have projects in multiple countries in South Asia and East and West Africa. And we work with and for people with disabilities to improve their access to work of relevance today, as well as education and healthcare. And we also aim to address negative stereotyping and discrimination. But I think some people we work with can give you a better sense of the consortium and the work we do. Next slide, please. So just a couple of examples of some of the projects that we'll be talking through today. And this is Washuka. So Washuka is a woman with a disability who runs a salon in Thika in Kenya. And Washuka has been part of the Inclusive Futures program there. Washuka participated in continued training from our business development service provider there. She learned how to manage her business better, including record keeping, how to save, how to brand, how to promote her business, and she has reported that her business is booming. So this particular program in Kenya is led by our partner Light for the World, who you'll be hearing from later, in partnership with Humanity and Inclusion, who you'll also be hearing from later, alongside Sense International and the National OPD, that's Organisation of Persons with Disabilities, UDPK. Next slide, please. And this is Samanja on the right here. So Samanja is 34, she's non-verbal, and she didn't have the opportunity to complete her education. Now Samanja is a successful graduate in the Disability Inclusive Skills Development Programme in Bangladesh, and that is led by BRAC, who you'll also be hearing from later. So BRAC is one of our consortium partners alongside ADD, Sense International, Light for the World, and local and national OPDs who they've partnered with there in this successful program. Now, Samanja has completed vocational training both in the classroom with other learners and as a trainee in this very tailoring shop, alongside this master craftsperson who themselves were trained in disability inclusion. Samanja has now bought her own sewing machine with her earnings and is able to save every month. Now, I hope this gives you an example of some of the work that we do when we're talking about livelihood interventions. Next slide, please. But alongside that direct work, so that direct project implementation where we work with and for people with disabilities, we also have this real commitment to actually share what works and what doesn't. So this is an example of sharing lessons learned. We also partner with academic partners to produce really rigorous evidence alongside this. So based on that, I would really like to introduce our panel today, who will be sharing some of their experience behind the scenes in these programs. Next slide, please. So it's my pleasure to welcome Collins Ombajo. So Collins is a disability inclusion facilitator within Business Kenya. He's also a national OPD, again, Organisation of Persons with Disabilities member, as part of the United Disabled Persons of Kenya. So welcome, Collins. Next up, we have Arinatwe Sharma, goes by Sharma. So Sharma is a livelihood technical specialist in BRAC, Uganda, and Sharma will be sharing experience from the Disability Inclusive Ultra Poor Graduation, a project which wrapped up with some really fantastic evidence and learning at the beginning of this year. Welcome, Sharma. We also have Lucy Murage. So Lucy is the head of programs with Light for the World Kenya. Lucy will be sharing her experience from the recently scaled up project in Kenya known as In Business. So that's really exciting when we take something from a pilot to a scale and we see if it can work at that scale. So Lucy will be sharing experience there. We also have Tasmia Tabassum Rahman. Tasmia is the Associate Director in the Skills Development Program with BRAC Bangladesh. And Tasmia will be sharing experience from the recently completed vocational training and youth employment scheme that BRAC have been running for many, many years, and alongside OPD and other partners, OPDs and other partners, they took on a very significant disability inclusion element in this training. Welcome, Tasmia. And lastly, from our panelists, we also have Albert Macharia. So Albert is a regional economic inclusion specialist in the East Africa region with humanity and inclusion. Albert has worked on several of our Inclusive Futures programs and will be sharing his experience from the region, including Kenya and Uganda. And lastly, we have a special guest joining us today who will be closing the panel to bring a wider perspective on global commitments and the work that's being done on a wider scale. So we're really honoured to have Stefan Trömel, the Senior Disability Specialist with the ILO, the International Labour Organization, joining us to close the panel today. So thank you. Now, you know about our speakers, and next we'd like to know about you. So next slide, please. So we have a couple of questions that we would like to ask you. On the screen now, you'll see a Menti link. You also see a QR code. And we're requesting that you go to Menti and you type in the following code, 17488885. I see that Hazel, our tech support, has also copied that into the chat. So join the Menti poll. And please note that if you're not able to access that, we'll also ask the questions here and you can put the questions into the chat. Okay. So once you're in Menti, we can go to the next slide, please, Hazel. I can see some thumbs up coming. That probably means people are in. So once you're in Menti, you should see this question. It says, what is your knowledge of disability inclusion? And we have 4 options. Again, you can drop these into the chat if you're not able to access Menti directly. So what's your knowledge of disability inclusion? Are you an expert? Do you know quite a lot? Do you know just a little, or are you totally new to this? So we're really keen to understand maybe if we kind of what type of specialism you might be bringing today. And we really want to hear and sort of see what you can bring in the chat or in the Q&A. Please do share resources, etc. So I can see we've got a good amount of expertise in the room. Definitely more than half say that they know quite a lot. So please share kind of your comments and experiences in the chat as we go along. We've got a few who know a little. Okay, we seem to all have some level of exposure to this. So that's great. We really hope we can build on that in the session today. And I think we could go to the next question. So we just have one more question. And what's your knowledge of livelihood programs? So we're talking about these 2 really important areas combined. What's your knowledge of livelihood programs? Are you an expert? Do you know quite a lot? Do you know a little, or are you totally new to this? In Inclusive Futures, we work across multiple areas, livelihoods being one of them, as well as health and education. So we bridge a lot of really important sectors. It looks like we also have some really good expertise on this. So welcome. We've got 5 experts in the room, which is fantastic. With 1 person totally new, I'd also put myself in that box. So a bit of solidarity there, as well as people who know quite a lot. So that's fantastic. We really hope we build on that experience today. Okay, thank you. Now, I think without further delays, it's my pleasure to hand over to our first speaker. So I'd like to welcome to the panel Collins Ambajo. So Collins, really over to you to set the scene today. Why do we need to be talking about livelihood and training programs as needing to be disability inclusive? So in what ways are many of the livelihood programs and approaches and policies still not disability inclusive? Over to you, Collins. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. The best way to combat discrimination and stigma that affect persons with disability all over the world is to empower them. And by empowering them, you expose them to the livelihood programs, give them education, and they will have that self-confidence. So allow me to run through 5 points as to why we need to talk about livelihood programs that are inclusive of the interests of persons with disability. The first point is that people with disability in developing countries experience greater poverty than those without disability. So there's need to merge this gap where persons with disability should not rely on their caregivers or relatives for daily provisions. They need to be independent and have their own livelihood programs. Secondly, research that is unaccredited has it that 80% of persons with disability in the world are unemployed. This exposes them to the dependence, to be dependent on their caregivers and families. This again merges to the first point that I've talked about. There's need to empower them so that they can be self-reliant. Additionally, the third point is that lack of access to funds is a major obstacle to establishing businesses for persons with disability. Many potential lenders do fear giving their services to persons with disability as they see this as a risk. But this again is a myth according to the inclusion policies. This again is backed by Article 27 of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability in the World, which highlights the importance of work and employment, which should be freely chosen in a work environment that is open, inclusive, and accessible to the interests of persons with disability. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, Article 23(1), affirms that there has been the right to work is given to all, disability notwithstanding, and every person has to have a free environment of employment and be reasonably accommodated. Lastly, there's need to tap into the unexploited market, labor market that is inclusive of the interests of persons with disability. Persons with disability are innovative. The innovation has not reached the labor market, given the various accommodative features that they may need. This, if tapped by companies, they can have a whole load of market for the products that are inclusive of the interests of persons with disability. So as to why many programs are not inclusive of the interests of persons with disability, I will run through the barriers that hinder inclusion of persons with disability in many livelihood programs. So persons with disability encounter the following barriers in livelihood programs that are public. One, accessibility. This is not limited to physical accessibility, but again, communication that are passed targeting the populations, general populations, are not inclusive of the interests of persons with disability. Policies that come with different government and other stakeholders in the livelihood programs are also not inclusive of the interests of persons with disability. the attitudes that the general populations have on persons with disability are not inclusive of the interests of persons with disability in livelihood programs. So there's need for these to change to be inclusive. Secondly, communication that I've talked of, there's needs to tailor-make communication targeting persons with different types of disability. Disability is not homogeneous. This means that different disabilities requires different types of accommodation. So this being in mind, there's need to tailor-make communication to target the various categories of disability that individuals have. The attitude, again, this is a very huge barrier that is inbuilt in people. There's need to have a positive approach that is inclusive of all populations, disability notwithstanding. Participation is another huge barrier that hinder persons with disability in livelihood programs. The participation and active involvement of persons with disability in livelihood and decision-making processes is necessary for inclusion of persons with disability. And lastly, comprehensive accessibility of materials, resources, environments that livelihood programs are created to target communities must be of interest to persons with various types of disability. Thank you very much.
Collins, thank you so much. You've set us up really, really clearly in what I hope some of our other panelists will be able to provide really practical examples and responses to. And to everyone who's joined us today, Collins, is obviously going to be around for the whole session. You can ask additional questions to Collins in the Q&A, and hopefully we'll be hearing from Collins again a little bit later. Now, I'd like to welcome to the panel Sharma, Aranetwe Sharma, who's our livelihood technical specialist with BRAC Uganda. Now, Sharma, as part of BRAC Uganda, you adapted a mainstream livelihoods program to be disability inclusive. Would you be able to tell us some of the important adaptations that stood out for you to improve inclusion? And was there anything that worked particularly well? Over to you, Sharma.
Okay, thank you, Lisa, and a warm welcome to everyone. Yes, of course, as most of us might know, BRAC has the ultra poor graduation model that's already fundamentally developed to meet the needs of extremely vulnerable households to be able to be set on a pathway to sustainable livelihoods. And looking at that and how that has worked over 20 years in Bangladesh, but also outside that in Uganda, the model, we were able to modify it to make sure that it's disability inclusive. And with all the features that are tailored around the graduation pillars, there were specific features or modifications, adaptations made that were especially important to ensure that persons with disability can actively participate across all the program interventions. And some of this definitely looked around, if we look around financial inclusion, we have the village saving and loans associations. These were made inclusive in ways that the leadership committees of the VSLAs included as a must, at least 40% of the leadership committee had to be persons with disability. And to make sure that the VSLAs sit in accessible venues so that everyone can be able to access savings, but also the loans. VSLAs created a platform for participants to be able to access messaging on how to manage disability in the community, but also overcome a lot of stigma that community associate with disabilities. So across the project, we saw a lot of increase in savings, not just for persons with disabilities, but also for community members. Outside that, we look at livelihood. Livelihood is important, and as part of graduation, the livelihood promotion pillar was adapted to ensure that it's disability inclusive. by providing assistive and mobility devices to persons with disability so that they can increase their functional autonomy, but also personally, practically take part in income generating activities. Of course, some of the things that were noted in the needs assessment before that was that persons with disability would really be limited in accessing income generating activities, like Collins has said, because of accessibility. If I can't be able to take my goats for tethering, I can't be able to be interpreted if I have a hearing impairment and I have no sign language interpreter and I am operating a shop. How do I communicate with my clients? So we were able to work around that to ensure that we provide assistive and mobility devices, but also do home and work adaptations so that participants or persons with disability can be able to increase their participation in income generating activities. And some of the things that really worked well was ensuring that the village and saving loans associations are set up in accessible venues, but also persons with disabilities are empowered to be part of the leadership for those groups. Those are just some of the few.
Shama, thank you so much. And I should say that at the end of this webinar, we'll be sharing a link to the Inclusive Futures website, which has the toolkit, which has a lot of these lessons learned and these disability inclusive adaptations, which Shama is talking through. Now, just Shama, I wonder if there's one or two challenges that you could also share about anything that you encountered during those adaptations and how BRAC Uganda and other partners might have overcome them.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. So definitely from the experience of the project that we implemented, one of definitely the challenges that came up was stigma that communities associate with disabilities and how it limits persons with disabilities from actively taking part in not just income generating activities, but also community engagement. So that is something that we worked around by creating awareness, not just for participants, but for the community as at a larger scale, but also community leaders to understand what disability is and what disability inclusion is, and how communities can best support members to be able to move out of the stigma that's created around that, but also to facilitate improved livelihoods. Then, of course, one of the challenges, because the project was implemented in the midst of 2 COVID lockdowns, was how to sequence provision of assistive and mobility devices and enterprise asset transfers like the livelihoods. Because one of the key, I think, learnings for us was that if you're giving assistive and mobility devices, this should be sequenced at the same time as when you're doing enterprise or asset transfers for livelihoods. If that is not done, you realize that persons with disability, because of the accessibility barriers they face to actively participate, they will still leave the responsibility of enterprise development, income generation to caregivers. And for us as a project, that would not have served the purpose, because the purpose was to ensure that they actively take part in that. So we're able to find a way to, to cover the gap, but for any scale that would be coming up, that is something that is key to note. Then, of course, the second one is the orthopedic services. In Uganda, this was a project that was implemented in a rural part of the country. And in this part of the country, orthopedic services and technologies are really limited. So, of course, if you're looking at sustainability of a project beyond just what you're doing now, you want to make sure that any rehabilitation services that you're giving, any orthopedic technologies can be accessible, not just for repairs, but for any need that comes up, can be accessible within the region. So, of course, part of the work we did was engaging the locally available orthopedic technologies, and there's a workshop in the regional referral hospital in the area we're working in, and we engage them on the project instead of looking out for service providers outside the operational area, because after the project ends, participants might not be able to access that because it's far. So making sure that some of these services can be accessible in the region, but also creating linkages so that participants or households know that if there is need for that, it can be accessed from here and at this cost or at no cost, and building that courage for them, because part of what stigma does on the negative effect is that it will make people fear to reach out for services, even if they are free. So creating an understanding, yes, services, these and these services available, this is how you can access them, but also help them access them at the beginning of the project or during the project life will support a lot of the sustainability even after the project ends. So those were some of the things that might not have worked well, but were really key learnings to any future work that would be done around disability inclusion, especially for graduation projects.
Shama, thank you so much for such clear challenges and really clear examples of solutions working together in partnership. And I will point that there's already questions for you in the Q&A, so please go across there. Before we go to our next speaker, I want to note that we do have someone asking for live captions. So for anyone who joined us after housekeeping, we do have a live captioner engaged for this webinar. So please do click on the captions button at typically the bottom of your screen, depending on the format, and select show captions. Thank you. Now, next up, we're going across to Lucy Murage. So Lucy is the head of programs in Light for the World Kenya. And Lucy, as head of programs, you've overseen a livelihoods project which has recently scaled up as part of Inclusive Futures in more districts in Kenya. So we're really keen to hear from you about what are the key approaches to inclusion in terms of livelihoods work that you're now finding can work at scale. Over to you, Lucy. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, and a warm welcome to everyone. Just to bring everyone in speed, that in business program in Kenya, the pilot phase started back in 2019 to 2021. That was the innovation phase. And we learned a lot of lessons of what is working well, what is not working well. What worked well is what informed the scale phase, and that is what we're implementing now. Now, into the key approaches to inclusion that is working now very well into the scale, I want to take 5 key approaches, and I want to start with our disability inclusion facilitator approach as approach number 1. When we define disability inclusion facilitators as young persons with disabilities who also belong to organizations of persons with disabilities, the program aims at building their capacity through intensive training on disability inclusion, disability assessment, and the whole process. They also receive mentorship, who in turn goes back to the community to work very close with organizations of persons with disabilities in their districts. And in Kenya, we call them counties. They support the organizations of persons with disabilities to plan the inclusion work very well, right from developing their advocacy plans, implementing them, linking with the government facilities, members of communities, and other partners working in their districts. And our model on disability inclusion approach was co-created by our organizations of persons with disabilities, because it is a twin track approach whereby organizations of persons with disabilities and DIFs will work together in pushing the inclusion agenda. Another key approach, it's the provision of reasonable accommodation. What we learned in the innovation phase is that lack of reasonable accommodation may hinder participations of persons with disabilities. And this I'm linking to what Collins shared with us earlier. This may include internal procedures that clearly defines what reasonable accommodations are. For example, if I want persons with disabilities to attend a training, I need to know in advance what exactly do this person require to enable him or her attend my training without difficulties. For example, this person may require a guide who is maybe professional. This person may require a caregiver to support him coming to the training facility, or even translating, or even lifting or transferring the participant. We also include things like transport. We realized transport is a key reasonable accommodation, and it depends with the type of transport and also the distance that this person is covering for that person to be able to participate. How we do this approach is that we get the request for the reasonable accommodation prior to the activity. For example, if I'm planning for a training, I need to know who are my participants, what do they require for reasonable accommodation, and I'll be able to provide them during the activity. And currently, what we are doing to improve this approach is to work with our advocacy partner, United Disabled Persons of Kenya, to come up with reasonable accommodation guidelines that we'll be sharing with our partners for future planning. The other key approach is on the organization of persons with disability engagement. OPDs, like we call them, they belong to the community. They are structures that are existing and that has been there. And what the in-business program here in Kenya is looking at, it's a whole process, right? From identification of organizations of persons with disabilities, looking at the key factors. What are we really looking in an organization of persons with disability? Some of the key factors we look for when we are doing the identification is one, gender representation. Number two, representation of diverse disabilities. We work with organizations of persons with disabilities, and we start also to capacity build them. We assess their needs. So we do capacity assessment. And once we identify the challenges and the difficulties, we make a capacity plan and we start building their capacities on the areas they need to be strengthened. In turn, we see them taking lead in terms of advocating for the rights of persons with disabilities, engaging the government in those kind of dialogues, and even help supporting the program to pass the information on the livelihood programming. Persons with disabilities get information through the Organization of Persons with Disabilities engagement. The other approach I would also like to mention is that the program involves persons with disabilities in all project cycles, right from initial assessment, whereby we gather the needs of the people before we start designing the project. And once we design the project, we also invite them for validation because they propose to us the challenges they are facing, and we are also able to analyze the gap based on what persons with disabilities have shared with us. So we involve them in all project cycle management, even during implementation. We invite them for induction or what we call onboarding sessions to come and understand what the project is all about, to understand the timelines and what we are going to do in the program. We also invite them to forums like Lessons Learned, whereby they also share with us some of the key lessons, and they also help us to validate the lessons of all the evidences that we are saying, this is working well and this is not working well. Then I'd like also to mention, lastly, about our project communication plan. If we want to communicate back to the community, we adapt our project communication plan to what is already in the community mobilization plan within the community. And this is where we involve OPDs for mobilization and other key stakeholders. For example, a key stakeholder is the National Council for Persons with Disabilities, who really has the mandate for persons with disabilities in the community. And again, working alongside with the leaders of persons with disabilities. So those were the key inclusion approaches that are working very well in the scale phase. Lisa.
Lucy, thank you so much. Such richness there, and great to hear about that entire project cycle where there's been that commitment to inclusion. Now, just before we pause for a moment, I do want to come back to Lucy really quickly, because as part of scale in Inclusive Futures, we're also thinking about sustainability and capacity strengthening. So I'm also really keen to hear about kind of what's next at scale, what you're putting in place to make sure that it continues to have influence.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. What I would like to talk more, it's on the capacity building that we have given or transferred to persons with disabilities, organizations of persons with disabilities, and the disability inclusion facilitators. So this capacity building remains, even if the project is going to an end. What we have learned so far is that even when we are not there, persons with disabilities and the skills they have gained in terms of implementing their businesses, they will still implement the businesses because they have the confidence, they have what it takes to continue even after this project. Organizations of persons with disabilities, referring to my points earlier, the capacity building, the capacity strengthening we have done to the OPDs, we are confident that they will continue with the same, and they will continue with the same project activities approach because they have what it takes. Our DIF model, our disability inclusion facilitators, will still remain with the intensive capacity building skills they received within the program and be able to implement the project goals even when we are not there, together with the organizations of persons with disabilities. I'd also like to talk about our private and public institutions approach, because we work with them in terms of creating market linkage for persons with disabilities who are doing businesses. And we support them to become more inclusive in terms of policy, in terms of perception. And this is something that Collins talked about. They have been taken through a disability inclusion journey, and they have shown commitment. And one success that I must mention now is that we have seen many public and private institutions engaging persons with disabilities who are doing business in different value chains, in different capacities, and that will continue even when we are not there. We also work with strategic partners. For example, I'd mention the National Council for Persons with Disabilities, which is the government arm for persons with disabilities interventions, including the budget allocation, including the strategies for persons with disabilities in the country. Because they are our partners, we have an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, and the agreement is to complement each other, looking at the areas of synergy, and they are our partners. And we are also expecting that even when we are not there, the model will still be replicated by the government, which is the National Council for Persons with Disabilities, and continue that. And they are going even to, put it in their budget allocation as one of the key intervention, because it's a good model that has been validated even by the government stakeholders. Yeah, so back to you, Lisa. Thank you.
Lucy, thank you so much. Again, so many practical examples of how you're embedding sustainability and influence through that scale program. And Lucy, I'll also note that there's a lot of interest in the Q&A about what you're speaking about. Now, before we head over to Bangladesh, actually, we'd like to pause for a moment and send you back to Menti, actually, because we want to have a check-in to see what's landing for everyone. I can see a lot of richness in the chat and in the Q&A, so thank you for those contributions. But please, if you have access, please do head over to Menti again. You'll see there's a new number which has been copied into the chat because we have another question for you. So the number for menti.com is 4357 6296, 4357 6296. I can see a few people joining there. And the question is, what is one interesting thing you've heard or learnt from the panelists so far? So we're keen to hear what's landing. What has stood out for you? So this is an open word question. You can type your response, and we'll give it a few moments to see what responses are coming up. So what's really standing out for you? You've heard from Collins, you've heard from Shama, you've heard from Lucy, all speaking about kind of different stages of intervention. Some of the barriers or the challenges, some of the really practical adaptations, and some of the examples of what works at scale. So far there's some responses. The importance of planning ahead for reasonable accommodations. Yes, absolutely. Sustainability. Yeah, what we're thinking about in terms of actually what lasts, what really makes a long-term impact. These partnerships with local organizations and the sustainability becomes part of that. Absolutely. And I think Tasmia will hopefully speak more about that as well. Shifting power to OPDs and persons with disabilities. Yeah, there's some fantastic questions around OPD engagement that I see in the Q&A, and great to have so much interest and experience there. Barriers to deal with and some promising approaches to use. Fantastic. Practical and specific learning on what it takes to achieve disability inclusion. The need to sequence and align MD, AD, apologies that I don't know what that stands for, with asset transfers. Again, not a livelihoods expert. Otherwise, caregivers that over. So thank you for that, that contribution. That disability inclusion is core in our program, and we should plan for integration. Absolutely, we're not talking about separate program. This is absolutely integral and foundational inclusion as something that every program needs to be including. If it's not including people with disabilities, then it's not effective and it's exclusionary. Making VSL, I think these are village savings and loan schemes, as I saw in the chat. Inclusive is very interesting. Fantastic. Please keep those responses coming in, and we are collecting your questions as well, and hoping to the ones that aren't answered directly in the Q&A, hopefully there'll be time for them after. I'm also seeing a lot of really fantastic questions and reflections in terms of people's experience about negative stereotyping and discrimination, sort of social behavior change. This is also really coming up as questions alongside the really practical work that we're talking about. So naming that we're seeing that as well. Okay, thank you. Now, Tasmia Tabasam-Rahman, as the Associate Director for the Skills Development Programme in BRAC Bangladesh, you oversee an already very successful and established vocational training programme, which through partnerships you've now made inclusive of people with disabilities. So can you tell us more about those partnerships and how you partnered to make disability inclusion possible in this established programme? Over to you, Tasmia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and very rich discussion and contributions, I must say. Thank you. This has been wonderful to hear. Just with a little bit of background, some of I mean, most of you probably know BRAC, but those of you who don't, I mean, we are a Southern NGO that started in 1971 with a focus on inclusion. So inclusiveness is one of our 4 core organizational values, which makes disability inclusion an organizational priority, of course. So the approach has always been that inclusion has to be at the heart, providing access and services to maintain equity and equality. In terms of solutions towards disability inclusion, we have worked extensively in education, healthcare, and now in skills development and livelihood, as well as social enterprises. As you have heard from our colleagues globally, BRAC started in Bangladesh, but of course we are now in 10 other countries, scaling up efforts in microfinance, educations, and of course our flagship program, Livelihoods, through Ultra-Poor Graduation Initiative. Just to give you a little bit of scale, I mean, just last year, we have reached 65 million people through various health-related interventions only in Bangladesh. 0.23 million has been reached through training, livelihood support, and loan support only in Bangladesh. And the skills development program is a very tiny effort. We started in 2015, reaching about 40,000 people every year to train youth and adolescents. Now, the training program is divided into various different kinds of training, one being the STAR model that I will talk about, which is about this project, which is a non-formal approach to inclusivity. But then we also have access to classroom-based training, hybrid training, career counseling, entrepreneurship, and so on and so forth. So very quickly, the STAR model is basically a very local effort to bring in technical vocational training to youth and adolescents who otherwise cannot access skills in education. This is a very simple model where it's absolutely apprenticeship based. As you saw in the beginning of the photo of Samanjar, there's an elderly woman, and then there was Samanjar. She is basically the master craftsperson providing the training to the students, and the entire process is based on relationships. The employer and the employee, and the master and the student relationship and trust. So it's all about how do we bring these people together, how the trainers become more capacitated to understand the needs of the student, how are their training areas more accommodative. So with people with disability, as rightly mentioned, reasonable accommodation and investing in reasonable accommodation is very, very helpful. And now coming to your specific question on our partners. So we've worked with Light for the World, ADD International, Sense International, and CDD, and BRAC being part of this consortium, bring in the STAR model. What these OPDs have brought is basically to internalize what we were missing in terms of inclusion. So let's say we were targeting, but then the focus on the targeting has been expedited through our OPDs. We used to do behavioral change campaigns, but once the OPDs came forward, our behavioral change campaigns became more specific, more enabling, because as we all know, there's huge stigma around what people can and cannot do. Who is actually more deserving to go to the market and who isn't. So the sensitization messages became a lot more focused. Light for the World has engaged with us with 10 disability inclusive facilitators who worked with our mainstream staff, who know the model of the training, but then did not perhaps know enough about how to make our training more inclusive. So once they worked together, our targeting, our placement, the capacity building, as well as learning became a lot more disability friendly. We have developed disability inclusive scorecard assessment, and that was sort of absolutely with the support of Light for the World. And there was an action plan developed, which we have now mainstreamed. The TOT that we have developed for our trainers has also been mainstreamed. So right now, going forward, the apprenticeship training that we will provide will have all these elements included, as well as the staff pool who now has a lens on disability, which definitely wasn't there before. And also, just to add, ADD International and CDD received detailed knowledge on BRAC's apprenticeship model. So the learning was vice versa. So now if they were to design a model that will be about the apprenticeship training, they will be able to do so. So those are, on a nutshell, very high level points that I wanted to make on how this partnership worked, and the OPDs were instrumental in making our lenses more disability friendly. Thank you. Over.
Tasmia, thank you so much. Fascinating to hear of the strength of those partnerships and some of the really practical things, such as the disability inclusion scorecard, which I know that BRAC really opened up to. Just back to you briefly, what's next for BRAC's livelihoods work now that BRAC has much more experience kind of building on that original commitment to inclusion, now that BRAC has much more experience in disability inclusion through the Inclusive Futures Consortium?
Right, so just briefly touched upon this. So basically this informal based training is BRAC's own. We have been doing this for the last 10 years, and we have trained about 120,000 students through this. We have about 8,000 people with disability included. And since this training is extremely hands-on, we ensure more than 90% of informal employment for these students. So as the model of STAR continues to provide support to our youth and adolescents, these internalization of methods, tools, models will continue to be mainstream. So that's obviously number one. The facilitation and TOTs that were developed, inclusive training room guidelines that were utilized, how do we make reasonable accommodation where identified. So those are, again, internalized in our tools. The behavioral change campaign toolkit, for example, is another very good example of how we are effectively and efficiently going to organize our awareness for communities and families to address disability-related stigma. We have captured and well documented the learnings, right? So the project has such tremendous rich learning for us, and that is definitely there to continue to support us even with the new staff that comes in. I mean, we have the capacity through STAR to train up to 50,000 students per year, given that we have funding. So of course, it's an example of scale. And lastly, the partners that we work with, BRAC works with 20 national NGOs in Bangladesh. So this knowledge that we have, we hope to transfer to our regular implementation partners, who then can, of course, scale this and replicate this throughout Bangladesh. So that's definitely our aim. Over.
Tasmia, thank you so much. 50,000 learners. I love that potential. Just to note that Tasmia mentioned a social behaviour change toolkit. We have links to some of the social behaviour change content from the Inclusive Futures Consortium, which is on the Inclusive Futures website. And for everyone who's registered for this webinar, we'll be sending an email with some of these links and resources afterwards. Now, before we go over to Albert to wrap us up in terms of the kind of discussion part of the session, actually, I think we can go directly. So perhaps Albert, now Albert, as the Regional Economic Inclusion Specialist in the East Africa region with HI, with Humanity and Inclusion, you've worked in this field for a long time, and you've worked across several of the Inclusive Futures programs or projects. But really keen to hear from you what remains in terms of the work that you've seen being done. What are the big things that stand out for you in the opportunities that are still there, or the barriers that still need to be overcome to make livelihoods much, much more inclusive? Over to you, Albert.
Thank you, Lisa, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I'm happy to be part of this process. And I also want to thank my fellow panelists for the rich information they have been able to provide this morning. I would say humanity and inclusion formerly was called Handicap International. And since 1992, we have been in this business of inclusive livelihood. After we identified there is a need, we are currently working in the 3 East African countries, that is Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda. And next week, we are launching together with BRAC into Tanzania to do another disability inclusive graduation project there, which is quite a very good endeavor for us. I would say that going to your specific question, that there is still widespread exclusion of persons with disability. And I believe that we are yet to turn the tide. And this one is not from my own word, but even UDESA, the United Nations Department for Socio-Economic Affairs, also has confirmed this in a study that they did in 2018. Then I also look at, out of the engagement I have in the East African region, I've realized that women with disabilities are still excluded from opportunity, livelihood opportunity, talk even about TVET, access to TVET and all that. First, due to the cultural and other related barriers, like my colleagues have been able to put. In some region, cultural barriers, patriarchal societies that don't give women opportunities to be able to participate in livelihood and related activities is still very eminent. Then there is also another element of exclusion of persons we say that they have psychosocial disability. This is what we call unseen disabilities. They have always been at risk of exclusion from mainstream activities. One, because their disability cannot be seen. Second is that some of the disabilities are held to be mysterious. For example, epilepsy and other related conditions, such that they are denied the very opportunities to be able to be part of the mainstream activities that have been going on there. Further to this, I would like to look at what still need to be, the challenges are still remaining around 3 barriers. And one of the barriers is what we call systemic barriers. And here I'm referring to it as removing persistent systemic barriers. And this one, I am talking to this out of what I have seen. Even after the ratification by over 182 nations to the UNCRPD, we are still yet to see tangible results out of that. We have seen there are challenges related to the implementation and also monitoring and evaluating the processes. In Kenya, after we have been able to see this, we have been able to engage government and other stakeholders to be able to look at this clearly and be able to look at what are we doing and what remains to be done, even as we gear up to 2030 and the year 2030. And then we need to look at also the very good opportunity that has been provided under the SDGs and what we are doing under the SDGs in terms of inclusion, and also taking stock because they provide very good indicators of what we can be able to measure. Then there is another bit under systemic barriers, the inadequate resource allocation for inclusion. I remember one of the panelists alluded to this. Most governments, as you are aware, they have not been able to provide adequate resources. Even if we say that resources are limited, I know they are a budgetary constraint because of the myriad other issues they have been able to address. But even with that, resources have still not been adequate. The other challenges that I have seen there is in terms of the way government have structured the social protection programming. Most of it is provided to just cushion persons with disability to take care of their basic need. But I wish, like it has been done elsewhere, like in Korea, that we could be able to structure our social protection programming in terms that it goes beyond looking at the basic need, but in terms of how persons with a disability can be engaged in livelihood and how they can be able to participate in livelihood out of the resources, probably some additional resources that are provided. They are able to engage in livelihood, then become self-sustaining. The other barrier I would like to look at under this is what we call program level barriers. And my colleagues, I know they have looked at this. Under this is how we structure our programming. And one of them is how are we providing reasonable accommodation and assistive technology, especially when we are doing livelihood, we have seen, and I'm talking this with a lot of authority from the programming we did in Uganda together with BRAC. We realized we needed to provide personalized, reasonable accommodations, whether it is for those who are doing farming or those who are doing businesses. We need to look at what do they need as a person to be able to participate in a specific livelihood. And that is why I'm talking about personalized, reasonable accommodation. And the same also applies to assistive technology. And I believe this is also applies to TVET when we are providing tertiary and vocational training. We need to see that persons with a disability are provided with reasonable accommodation. On top of the accessibility of the venues, accessibility of the training, in terms of how the communication and the delivery of the curriculum is done, we need to make sure that this is tailor-made for persons with a disability. The other issues is on improving accessibility of workspaces, including TVET. And I remember we have also talked about transport services. And transport services here is not only providing a bus, but how can that bus be able to accommodate the persons with a disability to be able to get to their point of where they are doing their livelihood or where they are attending vocational training. Then we also need to address negative attitudes toward persons with a disability. As I've talked about the patriarchal society, I've talked about us, but we have also the attitude, even when you go to TVET, there is what the other students who have probably not seen a person with a disability in their class, they still have those attitudes, the teachers or the lecturers. We need also to work with them and see how we can best be able to help them understand how to work with the persons with a disability, how to provide services to them, and how to be able to help them participate directly without going through proxies. Then I have talked the issues of social protection programming. I'm not going to repeat that, but it is part of what would also come under programming. Then the other thing I have seen is that we also need to design a livelihood program that can withstand economic shocks. I remember we had COVID and most persons with a disability, even that had businesses, they really suffered. Some of them, I know they are yet to come back to their businesses. And I'm talking this from a COVID response project that we have implemented. It may not have been other inclusive features, but we have learned a lot, including on how to be able to deliver such programming within a COVID situation using both virtual or online support that can be provided. Then the other thing that I would look at finally is the barriers at the individual level. And persons with a disability, because of the stigma that they have gone through, they have internalized such, and they have almost stereotyped that, and this undermines their livelihood participation. And I'm talking this from that inclusive future program we did in Uganda. There is a gentleman we provided with a prosthesis. And before we provided prosthesis, he intimated to us that he could not venture out because of the discrimination, the stigma, and the way he used to view himself as a person that did not even withstand. We did not have the opportunity to start and tell anyone in the community about anything. But we were able to engage him in the livelihood program, provided our processes, and finally he became part of the leadership of the inclusive VSLA that was happening there. So provided him with an opportunity to engage with the community. And then he said that after all this, he is feeling very well able to engage with other members of the community, tell them of the importance of persons with disability, engaging in livelihood, and also in VSLA. That was quite a change for him. I'm giving this one as an example. Then the other thing that we need to look at is addressing the lower level of training of skill among persons with disability. As we have said, is that persons with disability due to discrimination, they do not have as skills as their counterpart without disabilities. And hence, when we are doing our programming and when we are looking at the individual, we need to look at the level of skills and what we need to, how do we need to build their capacity, which skill set do they need to have so that they can be able to feel as part of the society, including the life skills, like the one that we are doing in Uganda, building their confidence, building their capacity to engage. That is also quite important. Then there is the element of providing requisite skills, especially when we are preparing persons with disability to be able to join the job market, including some of the behavior change that they need to undertake, and also some of the skills they need at the workplace, including communication skills. There are some people who accuse persons with disability that they don't know how to communicate. But it's not they don't know how to communicate. It's sometimes the discrimination, the isolation, the exclusion. They have not been able to get some of these skills. So when we are preparing them for the job market, we need to be able to see that we are able to give them these skills. Then finally, we need to look at the added cost of disability that goes to do rehabilitation, treatment, and even accessible technology and accessible transport that hinder their participation in livelihood program, that hinder their participation in TVETs. And this one can also be included under what we are talking about, the programming. Because when we are also doing the programming, and you look at what is the persons that we are targeting, what is they need, what are the added cost of disability that we need probably to be able to take care of in our programming. We need to look at this also across all the levels, including at the systemic level. Thank you, Lisa.
Albert, thank you so much. Essentially an A to Z of how to make everything inclusive. If we can get every organization and partner to do that, then fantastic. But really comprehensive, going through the systemic barriers, the program barriers in each project as well as individual. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. Now, I've been seeing so much richness in the chat, and thank you to our panelists who've been responding very proactively, as well as to everyone who's been participating, adding their resources, their questions, and their comments. And I think we have time now to dive into a few of these comments before we go to our guest speaker to wrap us up. And I'd like to perhaps focus on a couple of questions or a couple of topics. The first one is around OPD engagement. There's been some richness in the chat. I want to point out a comment from Jane Watera, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, about the importance of having an OPD engagement strategy that's been co-created by OPDs and MEs, I think micro entrepreneurs, as well as the program team. So Jane is bringing in experience that that in one of the Inclusive Futures programs, they worked with UDPK, that's the national OPD, and country umbrella networks whose membership is other OPDs representing diverse disabilities. So thank you, Jane. And there's a very, very interesting question around what is the strategic goal of OPDs in terms of working in close association with innovative entrepreneurship hubs? So essentially, what is the relationship gain for OPDs? Collins, if you're still, oh yeah, you are still with us, fantastic. I wonder if you'd be willing to take on this question from Peter Istvan Danku, or to speak more broadly about some of the chats you've been having online about OPD engagement. Is that okay? Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. OPDs play a crucial role in advocating for inclusive spaces that persons with disability need to belong to. Whichever programs are designed without the consultation of OPDs, many a times not going the way they are purposed to work. I have ever evaluated a program in Western Kenya where it was claimed that they have the interests of persons with disability in the program. But additionally, looking at the program itself, it did have budgetary allocation for the inclusive services that accommodate persons with disability. Look at design of activity implementations, the venues where they hold their meetings. If they are not inclusive of the physical mobility of persons with disability, accommodation of communication interests of persons with disability, reasonable learning models that includes persons with disability, then these are not inclusive at all. So OPDs need to be consulted in any program design, and especially in inclusive livelihood practices. These are not limited to the national level. National level OPDs play a linkage role. They have a whole network of OPDs under them. They can link you to the OPDs that have presence in any part of the country or region where you want to work. So yes, the engagement of OPD is necessary in any program implementation.
Collins, thank you so much. Again, coming back to that inclusion part as something that's fundamental and foundational, and meaningful engagement with OPDs as a really central part of that. Thank you. There's also a very interesting question about, let me have a look. I'm interested in OPD capacity building. How do panelists assess when capacity building by NGOs has been embedded and is no longer required? I'm not sure this is a question that can easily be answered, or if there's ever a sort of end point. But I wonder if any of our panelists who, for example, work around that capacity assessment have any contributions to this question as well. Collins, I see you're still unmuted.
Yes, thank you. Well, we don't mean that OPDs are experts in programs implementation. They might have challenges in implementing designed projects and programs, but their expertise really lie on the accommodative interests that different persons with disability have. Lucy highlighted this, and Jane also, in her response to a question that was raised, responded that programs are designed with the interests of persons with disability and organizations of persons with disability at heart. So at this stage, many OPDs could be found that they lack maybe capacity to work program implementation and activities engaged. So this again necessitates the need for capacity assessment, organizational capacity assessment, and based on the findings of given organizations, then tailor-made trainings can be done to the organizations so that they be at par with the various programs that are designed to target them. So yes, I understand that there might be gaps in program implementation, but the working together, the networking and the collaborative efforts can answer the need for capacity building of organizations of persons with disability.
Collins, thank you. Yes, great point. I also see there's been a lot of comments in the chat around addressing discrimination, negative stereotyping. Several of our speakers touched on it. Albert, I know you went into it in quite a lot of detail around some of those barriers. And Tasmia, I know you've been really active in the Q&A, but I'm keen to hear if you have anything to share if you come on screen about some of the successful social and behaviour change work that BRAC, alongside other partners on this disability inclusion programme, has done to really work alongside some of the practical elements, looking at behaviour change. Over to you.
I mean, this is very interesting. I mean, while we see more and more donor money shrinking, saying that whether campaigns and social behavior changes dialogues and policy dialogues and all these, qualitative stuff, whether works or not, I mean, we think it works very, very well. And quantifying that is basically so important, especially when we are trying to engage the learners themselves, saying that, yes, you are capable. And you need to say this every day. When you talk to the parents, saying that, you are the drivers of this child's life change. So you need to really believe in what this person is doing. So that's a continuous messaging. And then, of course, you go to the community, you go to the markets. Of course, markets don't demand people with disabilities. It's not visible. I don't want to go through all these changes. They're not going to be good enough, and so on and so forth. So it's always about dialogues, and very, very much so, which is mundane, very boring, showing up every day, building the trust. It's like, you become part of the family. And for BRAC, it is very important that we have colleagues on the ground who are continuously doing this work in every community possible, because we are present everywhere. But again, I mean, OPDs, of course, add a lot of value when they also share all these messaging through their networks. So this needs to be a movement, not necessarily a one-off awareness campaign, if we will. So once the messaging is developed, there needs to be targeted messaging on how do you engage different kinds of disabilities differently. How do we engage boys and girls differently? Because it matters at a very, very focused, disadvantaged family level, where the parents and the brothers and sisters and the communities actually start engaging and believing that, okay, this is possible. And with the market, again, we found this the most challenging, because again, it's about productivity, it's about business case. But I think what we have tried to accomplish is that targeting productivity as opposed to perception, because 90% of this is perception. And then if we are able to showcase stories where we can say a successful business case of a person with disability who's able to work on an everyday basis, earn their living. And if this is a case where the employer is saying that, yes, I have no issues with productivity, I think those are the things that really, really matter. So lots of budget on social messaging, lots of budget on community engagement and dialogues will be very important. Thanks.
Thank you, Tasmia. I hope we have some donors in the room to start thinking about disability inclusive budgeting. Okay, great. Now we could continue this conversation all day. There is so many fantastic questions and responses in the chat. But I want to hand over to our guest speaker to wrap up. Now, we're really honoured to have Stefan Trömel in the room, and you've sat so patiently in the background, Stefan. Stefan is the Senior Disability Specialist with the ILO, the International Labour Organization. Stefan, really keen to hear from you as you've been listening to our panelists, seeing everything in the chat, to bring in your perspective as we begin to close the session. Over to you.
Yes, so thank you, Lisa, and hello to everybody. And thanks a lot for inviting me, and congratulations to the event excellent presentations, excellent questions, excellent answers. A few reflections from my side. In the ILO and the International Labour Organizations, we have been working a lot with the private sector to promote disability inclusive employment. And we've been doing that in Bangladesh, Bangladeshi Business and Disability Network. We've been doing that in Kenya with the Kenya Business Disability Network, Uganda, etc. No? So the good news is that we are seeing an increasing interest from the private sector. That was perhaps not there some years ago. At the same time, what we hear from the private sector often is, yes, we are willing to employ persons with disabilities, but we often struggle to find persons with disabilities who have the right skills, no? Which is a clear reflection why we need to increase, on one hand, disability inclusive employers, but at the same time also ensure that people with disabilities have the skills that the labor market is demanding. Now, the good thing about having more private sector interest, it can help us to change the expectations that are there in mainstream livelihood programs, in mainstream vocational training programs, perhaps expectations also among persons with disabilities, like Collins and Albert addressed, that persons with disabilities can become employees in the private sector and can also become entrepreneurs and perhaps be in the value chain of companies. And I think that is a game changer. To showcase that the companies are willing to do so will help us to address this idea that why should I invest in disability inclusion in a vocational training program if people with disabilities cannot later on move from training to employment. And the objective needs to be very clear, and I really appreciate the title of the session. It is about mainstream livelihoods. It's about mainstream vocational training. Still too often we see separate initiatives, often even led by disability organizations themselves, and they won't achieve the scale. They usually are not providing skills demanded by the labor market, and they also provide often an excuse for the mainstream programs to become more disability inclusive. So we really need to make it clear that the objective is mainstream livelihoods program, mainstream vocational training, mainstream business disability services need to be inclusive of persons with disabilities. But we also have to be clear, we're still far away from that, from achieving that reality. We've heard today very good examples, but we just did in the ILO, we are currently doing a study about disability inclusion in the vocational training system in the TVET. Lisa, thanks for spelling out the acronym in the chat, in 11 African countries. And the findings that we are seeing, I must say, are not surprising, but a stark reminder of where we are. First, even in countries where there is a policy or even legislation that mandates disability inclusion, also in the vocational training sector, it's not yet happening. We can't find good data. So if you, for instance, try to find out how many trainees with disabilities are there currently taking part in mainstream vocational training, you struggle to find any data that show how many trainees there are with disabilities. If you also, on top of that, you would like to know the breakdown between women and men with disabilities, impossible. And we need to permanently remind that, because the situation is even more difficult for women with disabilities. We don't know, we don't have information about accessibility measures being taken by these institutions. Would they have a reasonable accommodation fund or reasonable accommodation policy? We don't know. What we know is that usually in the survey that we have done is there continues to be a lack of knowledge and capacity among staff of these institutions to become disability inclusive. No? So we need to continue pushing for that. And I would like to address, because I mean, I think that I was very interested to follow the discussion and questions around the role of OPDs. And I fully agree that the role of OPDs and organizations supporting OPDs, like those that are also here on the call, play a key role. And play a key role not so much to deliver the training themselves. I think we need to somehow hold ourselves back from that. No, we need to make sure that those that have an expertise in training other young people, become experts also on how to train young people with disabilities. So for me, it's clear that the role of OPDs is a role of support and advice to mainstream training providers. And we have had very good examples the Light for the World model on disability inclusion facilitators, the examples provided by Tasmia from BRAC. We have seen how that works, but we just need to increase and scale up the role of OPDs in that. It's about combating stigma and discrimination. It's about providing advice to mainstream organizations on what the concept means of reasonable accommodation, how to have a reasonable accommodation policy, how to have a reasonable accommodation fund that could provide these situations, how to provide tailored support to persons with different types of disabilities. We were reminded, I think it was Collins, that definitely persons with disability is not a homogeneous group. They are very different situations. So I think there's a clear role of OPDs to provide that advice. And also on the outreach, very often we see that even when organizations become more inclusive, then still they're saying, well, but now we have still no candidates coming to us. Well, there is a clear role of OPDs and a clear capacity to contribute to the outreach, so that once institutions become more inclusive, this leads then also to actual more participation of persons with disabilities. And the last idea, Lisa, I just want to share is this question of capacity building. Very often what we see is a capacity building as a one-way road. No, we are building the capacity of OPDs. No, we need to engage in capacity building as a road that goes in two directions. It's OPDs have a role in building the capacity of vocational training institutions, livelihoods organizations, et cetera, and the other way around. No, it's a two-way bridge. It's a two-way road where both are experts in their specific areas, and I think it's a perfect excuse for more bridge building between both sides. Lisa, I'll leave it there, and I thank you again for having me invited to this event. It was a real pleasure.
Stefan, thank you so much. Now it's just on me to signpost you, because there's so much that we can continue to share. Inclusive Futures has a hub page, which I see my colleague Holly has already shared in the chat. I've just dropped it in again, and you'll see it on your screens. It features examples from each of our speakers today, from the projects which they've been speaking through, as well as some of the resources there. We'll also be sharing a follow-up email with some of their contact details, either on LinkedIn or Twitter, so you can continue the conversation directly, as well as the recording from today. Now, lastly, it's really just to say thank you to our speakers. Please drop on your video if you still have tech access, and really thank you to all of our really engaged attendees today. So I think we can wrap up there. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.